This is the Range Rover Sport.
And this is the Volvo XC90.
They are both big-selling, big SUVs, but which one is best?
In this review, we are comparing them in every area and taking them on a 200-mile journey to work out their real-world running costs. So keep watching until the end because we will be running through all of our results and, of course, picking a winner.
So, Will, I am in a Range Rover Sport plug-in hybrid. You are in a Volvo XC90 plug-in hybrid.
Correct, and obviously we are going to be comparing these cars overall, but we are mainly focusing on the plug-in hybrid side of things. We are working out their real-world electric-only ranges and also the fuel economy they achieve when their batteries are completely flat.
To do this, we have topped up their batteries, we've brimmed their fuel tanks, and we are doing a 200-mile journey starting and finishing in London. And this is a worst-case scenario test.
Yes, it is really, because we know that plug-in hybrids make most sense for people doing short journeys, mainly around town, because then you can use their electric power the majority of the time. But on our trip, we will be mostly on the motorway, and we want to find out what impact that has on their electric-only ranges, but also their real-world fuel economy.
And to be honest, it's not so ridiculous to be doing a journey like this in these two plug-in hybrids, because of course they are enormous luxury SUVs designed to carry lots of people long distances in great comfort. Now Will, tell me more about that XC90.
Well, this is the latest XC90, but really it's just a facelift of a car that first went on sale back in 2015. It has a new grille, a new infotainment system, we'll talk more about that later on. And this particular car is a T8 plug-in hybrid, so it's the most expensive engine that you can buy. And it's also in the range-topping trim called Ultra. And it has an official pure electric range of around 43 miles. What about your Range Rover Sport?
Well, this, of course, is sold as the sporty alternative to the full-fat Range Rover, and you get 5 seats only with the Range Rover Sport. If you want 7, you've got to go for the bigger, more expensive Range Rover. You get 7 seats as standard in the XC90, though. This is a Range Rover Sport in Dynamic SE trim, which is towards the upper end of the lineup, and it is the P460e, which is the plug-in hybrid version, of course. And again, like the trim level, this is one of the more expensive engine options in the lineup. It does, though, get a very good official electric range of around 70 miles. But how much does your XC90 cost?
Well, as I said, this is a range-topping XC90. And if you want one of these, you will be spending just over £84,000. So quite a lot of money. But how much does your murdered out Range Rover cost? Because I'm guessing the fact everything is painted in black makes it one of the cheaper options in the range?
Quite the opposite. In fact, if you like this Santorini black paint, if you like the black grille and the black grille surround, the privacy glass, my 23-inch black alloys, then all of those various different cosmetic bits and pieces add up to more than £6,000.
Okay, so the fact that everything is painted the same colour means you have to pay more for the car.
Correct. And that is just the tip of the iceberg, because the total amount of options fitted to this car adds up to £25,000. And that means, as tested, this costs more than £118,000. But, of course, you don't have to add all these options. In fact, we wouldn't really recommend that you do. The base price of this trim and this engine is more like £93,000.
Okay, that is still a lot of money, albeit a bit closer in price to this XC90.
For this test, we set the climate control to 21 degrees and automatic, and we were sticking to speed limits, of course. And the first task was to keep an eye on how many miles we could cover before the batteries went flat.
Hello, Doug.
Will, hello. We are 34 miles in. How are you getting on in the Volvo?
We are. Well, as you know, my car has a shorter official pure electric range than yours. And when I set off this morning with 100%, it was showing 35 miles. We have done so far 34 miles. I have 1 mile of range remaining. So that sounds like the trip computer was pretty accurate, doesn't it?
It does. But while it's accurate, that's not a particularly great pure electric range, is it?
It's not brilliant, to be honest, but it's worth pointing out that although we did about 12 miles of town driving, since then we have been on the motorway. So I suspect if you were to do purely low speed driving, you would get a few more miles before the petrol engine cuts in, which it's about to do because I've now dropped to 0 miles.
Okay, well I'm doing a little bit better than you. You'd hope that would be the case because I've got a longer official range and a bigger battery. I've got, according to the trip computer, 13 miles of range remaining, which is about 25% of my battery. But today we've got, well over 150 miles left of this journey, and you're going to have to do all of that on a flat battery. So it'll be very interesting to see what impact that has on your real world fuel economy using the petrol engine.
It would, but it's worth pointing out that my 2-litre petrol engine, it's a 4-cylinder, has just fired up. So that gives this a real world range, partly on the motorway, partly in town, of 36 miles. You have a much bigger, thirstier engine. So fuel economy wise, I reckon I could be in with a chance of winning. When it comes to pure electric range, clearly your car is a bit better.
Well, let's see what happens. Right, I have covered 45 miles exactly, and my range is down to 0. Luckily, I've still got a petrol engine to take me the rest of the way. 0% battery, 0 range remaining, 45 miles. Not amazing, but if you weren't doing a long motorway journey every day, still a range you could make use of in the real world. At the halfway point, we pulled over to take a closer look at the interiors.
Okay, so this is the XC90, and obviously it's been recently facelifted, but it is effectively a 10-year-old car. And you might think that that means the interior perhaps is a little bit disappointing for quality, and certainly it would look quite dated, but it doesn't really, does it?
Not at all, no.
It feels upmarket. There are lots of soft touch plastics in here, some grained wood effect, or perhaps even real wood, I'm not entirely sure.
And it's a nice colour scheme in here as well, isn't it?
It is. You can have various different colour schemes. And look, over the last decade, we've seen a lot of premium brands reduce the quality of their interiors.
Sure.
Audi, BMW. So the fact this is quite old school in terms of quality is not actually necessarily a bad thing. I'm not entirely sure what this school trouser fabric is on the dashboard there. It doesn't seem to match anything else in this interior, but other than that, I think it's really nice. And it's not just the quality of the materials, it feels very well put together too.
What about this though?
Yes, that is because when this car was first developed about 10 years ago, there was a 9-inch touchscreen infotainment system recessed into the dashboard very neatly. But obviously a 9-inch infotainment system isn't very big these days. Volvo wanted to give this facelifted version a bigger screen, but rather than redesign the entire dashboard, it has done something much simpler and has bought what looks like a tablet from Amazon Basics and just stuck it onto the dashboard.
Yes.
So it just looks like a grey box that blocks some of the air vents, so that's not particularly great.
Previously it was quite neatly integrated into the dashboard, wasn't it? But that is rather different now.
Yes, that's not the best look. It does spoil the clean lines of the rest of the interior, and actually the infotainment system itself, it's not terrible, but it's not one of the best. It's an Android-based system. It's a little bit fiddly to use. So yeah, overall, not great. And you have to use the screen to adjust the air conditioning because there are no physical controls for that.
But a good driving position in here?
Very, very good driving position. Volvo always does driving positions extremely well. You've got comfortable, supportive seats. Pedals line up nicely with the steering wheel. And also I've got a very good view of that digital driver display behind the steering wheel there. And I've got a good view out too.
Okay, so lots of strengths up front in the XC90. Let's take a closer look at the Range Rover Sport. Now, as we've said, this, as spec'd, is a significantly more expensive car than the XC90, but sat inside, you wouldn't necessarily guess that from the look and the feel in here.
No, I don't think you would. You've got a lot of piano black gloss here that we've seen from manufacturers building much cheaper cars. They use that to make the interiors feel a bit more premium, but when you're talking about a car this expensive, I'm not sure it's really that impressive.
And this plastic on the steering wheel for the controls also feels pretty cheap. And this is an area that you use quite a lot, so that is fairly disappointing.
It is, and although you don't necessarily touch these speakers that often, it's a bit of a shame they feel quite plasticky as well.
But it's certainly not like this is a terrible interior at all.
Far from it.
Because you've still got a really nice mix of materials. There's lots of soft touch, dense leathers around. So overall, it is still really nice. It looks pretty expensive in here, but it's just up at this price range, and compared to the cheaper XC90, it's not quite as consistent in the quality that it offers.
Yeah, I think if you were to get in this car in a showroom, You would think you're in an expensive, luxurious car. It's just when you start touching things, you might be a little bit disappointed.
It does have a slightly better infotainment system than the XC90.
It does.
It's a little more responsive, got a slightly more intuitive layout as well, but it's still not perfect.
It is definitely better. And although effectively you've got a screen plonked on the dashboard again, it looks a bit more integrated rather than a complete afterthought like it does on the XC90.
Sure. Unfortunately, like the Volvo, you've still got touchscreen controls for the air conditioning and the fan speed, which isn't ideal. But the driving position in this Range Rover Sport, like the XC90, is fantastic. You do sit what feels to be a little higher up than in the Volvo. Have a great view out and all around the car, lots of adjustment in the seats and the wheel. But the seats themselves aren't actually quite as comfortable and supportive as the XC90.
No, I would agree. The XC90 definitely wins for seats. But what about practicality?
Well, if it's quite close up front in terms of quality and infotainment, there's a much clearer margin when it comes to practicality, because the Range Rover Sport, for a start, has 5 seats. The XC90 obviously has 7.
Yes, and it's important to point out that you still get 7 seats if you go for the plug-in hybrid version, whereas in a lot of luxury SUVs, if you go for the plug-in hybrid, you lose the third row of seats.
And comparing the middle rows, again, it's actually the XC90 that offers more headroom and legroom.
It does. You've also got sliding and reclining seats. These seats don't slide back and forth in the Range Rover. And also, I managed to fit 10 carry-on suitcases under the partial shelf when we were testing these cars earlier. How many did you get in the Range Rover Sport?
Well, this still has a massive boot, but it could fit 9 carry-on size suitcases.
Okay, so the Volvo has a bigger boot again.
It does have a bigger boot. But let's just stress the point that this is not exactly a small car, is it? If you're looking to carry tall adults and lots of luggage, this should still accommodate you pretty well.
Yeah, I think if you don't need to carry more than 5 people, then you're not going to have any problems with the practicality of this car.
Agreed. Right, let's get back on the road.
Now, when the XC90 first came out in the mid-2010s, ride comfort was a bit inconsistent, to be honest, particularly on versions with air suspension fitted, which this T8 version gets as standard. Because things were okay when you're on a relatively smooth and undulating motorway, but not if you encountered anything nasty like a pothole. It really did crash over those. Things have improved massively over the years though, and actually this XC90 rides pretty well, not just on the motorway, but even around town on some badly surfaced roads. It's not the smoothest luxury SUV, it's not a BMW X7, it's not even an Audi Q7, but this car is pretty comfortable, and it's a similar story with the handling. There are more agile, more engaging SUVs in this price point, like the BMW X5, for example, and the Porsche Cayenne. But you know what? This feels alert enough. The steering, it's accurate, it's quite nicely weighted actually, even though you don't get any sense of connection at all really with the front wheels. One slightly disappointing aspect of this car though is the engine, because the electric motor is twinned with a 2-litre petrol under the bonnet, and when it fires up it sounds a little bit rough, to be honest, and you get a few vibrations filtering up through the steering wheel. It's not terrible, but in this price point a lot of plug-in hybrids have nicer engines.
Like this Range Rover Sport, which gets a 3-litre 6-cylinder petrol engine, and it does definitely feel like an upgrade over the engine that you have in the XC90. It sounds nicer, it's punchier in the performance that it delivers, but it's not the smoothest plug-in hybrid setup around, because the switch between power sources can be a bit clunky, to be honest. But if you're thinking of buying a Range Rover Sport, assuming that you're going to get some amazing handling SUV, then you might be a bit disappointed, because it's not actually as good dynamically as the XC90. This is a bigger, heavier car, and it does feel it. And to be honest, the steering isn't brilliant either, because around the straight ahead, it feels quite locked in and heavy, but then when you wind some lock on, the weight suddenly drops away in quite an unnatural way. And the 4-wheel steering feels a little disjointed at low speeds as well. When it comes to ride comfort, this again is behind the XC90. It's certainly not that this is uncomfortable, but it's just that impacts on the suspension are felt a bit more harshly in this Range Rover Sport, and the massive 23-inch alloys fitted to this car won't be helping its cause in that instance. They also don't help the overall refinement, because there's a fair bit of road noise in this interior, certainly more than what you have in the Volvo, and the same goes for wind noise around the front pillars. But even though the XC90 does have the edge in a few of those areas, this Range Rover Sport is still comfortable, and it's quiet as well. When we got back to London, we brimmed our fuel tanks and topped up our batteries to help us crunch the numbers. So it's time to go through the numbers, and we'll start with the real-world electric range. Will, in the XC90, you did how many miles?
36, which is actually very close to the official electric range that the car can manage. And remember, most of those miles were on the motorway.
Okay, the Range Rover Sport did 45 miles, which was actually very far from its official range. But how efficient were they and what did it cost? So when you charged up the XC90, how many kilowatt hours did you need?
In total, including charging losses, the Volvo needed 14.4 kilowatt hours to go from flat to full. So if you were charging at home at the current energy price cap, those 36 miles would cost £3.79. And that meant the average efficiency when running in pure EV mode was 2.5 miles per kilowatt hour, which isn't very good at all compared with most fully electric cars.
Well, on that theme, the Range Rover Sport needed 26.6 kilowatt hours to go from flat to full. That meant my efficiency was 1.8 miles per kilowatt hour, which isn't very good. And at the price cap, those 45 miles would cost £7.
That is a lot of money. Now, a couple of points to make here. Firstly, that's assuming you're paying about 26p per kilowatt hour at home at the current energy price cap. If you sign up to a cheap overnight tariff and you charge up during off-peak hours, then you'll obviously be paying less than that. But then some people might want to charge up using a public charger if they're out on a long journey, for example. We see plenty of PHEVs plugged in at public chargers when we're out testing EVs, don't we?
Yes, we do. And the Range Rover Sport can accept a CCS rapid charge, which you might think is fantastic because if you're taking it on a long journey with your family, perhaps on holiday, you're going to want to stop anyway. And if the battery's flat, that could be a perfect chance to just quickly top up the battery and get on your way again. But if you do that at a public charger, and if you're paying, let's say, 89p per kilowatt hour, then the 45 miles you would get from the full battery after that would cost you £23.67, which is absolutely outrageous, really, isn't it?
That is pretty awful. And with that in mind, it doesn't seem such a big deal that the XC90 doesn't have a CCS port for fast charging. In fact, from a typical single-phase power supply that you're going to have at home, it can only charge at 3.8 kilowatts, which isn't very fast at all. So you are going to be waiting around 5 hours to go from flat to the point that you can no longer drive in EV mode to 100%. Although, if you're only going to be topping up overnight at home, then perhaps that's not such a big deal. But we need to consider petrol costs as well, don't we?
Correct. So for the rest of the trip, we were running with flat batteries relying on the petrol engines. And how did that work out in the Volvo?
Well, our total journey was 200 miles pretty much on the nose. And as I said earlier, I did 36 miles on pure battery power, which meant 164 miles using the petrol engine. And by brimming the tank at the end of the journey, we brimmed it before we set off, of course, I can tell you that I used 20.95 litres of petrol, which on the day cost me £29.51. And that means I was averaging 35.6 mpg after fully electric mode was no longer available.
Okay, in the Range Rover Sport, my journey on pure petrol was 155 miles. But I actually needed a tiny bit more fuel than the XC90, even though the overall journey was shorter because my electric range was longer. It took 21.27 litres at the end, which cost me £29.97. And that meant I was averaging 33.1 miles per gallon. So, total cost for 200 miles for electricity and for petrol in the Range Rover Sport was £36.97.
Okay, so not a huge difference then, because in a Volvo, I paid £33.30.
Oh, right. So in the end, as you say, not a huge amount between them in real world terms for running costs on this specific test. The Range Rover Sport does have a better electric range, but the XC90 is more efficient. What other costs do we need to consider at this point?
Well, this is specific to the UK, but we should point out that plug-in hybrids make more sense for company car drivers paying benefit in kind tax than for private buyers. And the Range Rover Sport is particularly strong on that front. That's because the fact it can do more than 70 miles on pure battery power means that it qualifies for a 6% tax bracket, whereas the Volvo is in the 9% band. So even though the XC90 has a lower list price, you'll need to sacrifice more of your salary each month to run it.
But as you say, that is for company car drivers. If you're a private buyer signing up to a finance deal, then if you put a £10,000 deposit down on one of these cars, signing up to a 4-year PCP contract with a 10,000 mile annual limit, Volvo will want £910 a month, and Land Rover will want £1,127.
Now, the XC90 is lined up in its range-topping trim, which is perhaps one of the reasons it costs so much a month. And that does mean you get lots of kit. So you get ventilated front seats, you get rear privacy glass, 4-zone climate control, so your outer second row passengers can each enjoy their own preferred temperature. And all of those things cost extra on the Range Rover, don't they?
That is true. And so, overall, it seems pretty clear that the XC90 is the car that has the edge in a lot of areas, really.
Yeah, objectively, it is the better all-rounder. Although we can absolutely see why you might choose the Range Rover Sport, particularly if you like its image, or you're a company car driver paying benefit in kind tax.
But it is still the case, isn't it, that plug-in hybrids are fairly difficult to recommend because they only make the most sense in quite specific use cases. And for a lot of the time, actually, the way they use their electricity is pretty inefficient. And when they're just running on petrol power, they're fairly inefficient then as well. So for most people, they'd actually likely be better off with a regular petrol or a diesel, or even going for a fully electric car instead.
Yes, and particularly with the Range Rover. If you aren't a company car driver, we think the D300 diesel is a better choice. That's partly because it's cheaper, but also it's better to drive.
Okay, so there you have it. Plug-in hybrids, still not for everyone, but between the XC90 and the Range Rover Sport here, it's the XC90 which is the winner. Thanks very much for watching this review. If you want to see another one, click up there. Make sure you subscribe to our channel while you're at it. And to read much more about these cars and every other car around, click on that link to go to whatcar.com.